So it's starting time now. We'll give other people a moment to check in because they've still got quite a number of people logging in. Can you all hear me? Jeff, can you just give us a nod if you can hear me? Jeff Boyd? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, great. All right. So yeah, thanks for registering. We had we're overwhelmed by the response to this webinar, and so I hope you've all been having a great week and ready for this talk. I think it's going to be an interesting one by Dennis. It's our inaugural webinar, so bear with us if we have any technical issues beyond the normal ones you tend to have. My name's Anastasis Kokinos, and I'm the owner and director of Esanda. And Dennis Stickley is an international legal expert in petroleum law and very familiar with the challenges that are in front of us with the energy transition. And it's an interesting one because over the last few hundred years, since the Industrial Revolution, we've been using fossil fuels at will and without any thought about the adverse impact of the CO2 and pollution that they did generate. But we've become more efficient in the last 50 years. And I think there's a real drive to continue to improve that efficiency. Okay. We hope the webinar will provide you with better understanding of the key strategies and measures to achieve the net zero that we're all heading towards or aiming for in the future. And before handing over to Dennis, I just want to highlight that due to the overwhelming response to this webinar, we're going to repeat it for the North America time zone, and we're going to complement it with a couple of seminars. So they'll be a little bit more in depth. So for those of you who enjoy today and want to get more out of the topic, we'll send you information and a link to those seminars. Okay. And Dennis, I'll let Dennis introduce himself in a moment, but just before then, the guidelines for this webinar, we've automatically muted all the attendees because we had over 230 people register. I don't know how many will turn up, but they're piling in at the moment. For questions at the moment, please use the chat function and we'll try to answer your questions during the webinar or post the webinar. We'll have a Q&A session for that. And if we don't address all the questions live today, if we have too many and we run out of time, we'll follow up with you via email. And feel free to send other messages via email, after the event if you think of them post-event, or if you didn't get a chance to ask them during this event. We're recording the session, so hopefully we can, or not hopefully, we will put it up on our YouTube channel, so you can access that afterwards. And as I said, feel free to contact us at training@esandaengineering.com with any further questions. So after that, I'll hand you over to Dennis. You're ready, Dennis, I take it?
Right, ready.
I'll stop sharing the screen and we'll get Dennis on.
Right. Well, let's bring up the start of the slides. And we'll cue this now. Okay, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for the introduction, Anastasis. Yes, global warming is something we all have to be thinking about, but particularly it has a unique impact on the petroleum industry. Now, this transition is like all processes, something that takes place over time, and it is proving to be particularly complex. So we are only at the stage where we are really starting to see the main features of what the transition process is going to look like. And I should also say that it's a process that is going on in parallel channels, both at a governmental level, as witnessed by the recent climate summit that was held in Glasgow, and also it's going on at in the private sector as well, where many companies and their management are devising their own strategies. And I think the key feature I want to start with is for you to be aware that everything we're talking about so far is a voluntary process. So the actual approach and the standards have really just started to crystallize. And there's an immense amount of activity going on with expert groups and with trade bodies and standards organizations to come up with the tools and the methodology for dealing with the decarbonization of the upstream sector. Okay, so in today's talk, I'm going to divide it into 3 points. Part one is to help you focus on the terminology and the issues, because you need to kind of begin to add a whole other lexicon now to your toolbox as a professional in the petroleum industry. The second part deals with, what are the driving forces? Where's the impetus coming from on the transition? And it's multifaceted. This is one of the very interesting features, and also it's the drivers are ones that are gaining momentum, and also they're designed to ratchet up. In other words, to become more stringent over time. And finally, we want to close by looking at where are the gaps right now in being able to understand how we move along the pathway for energy transition. So we'll take it in these 3 broad portions in the discussion. Well, to begin with, in looking at how we focus on the issue, we're going to talk about the terminology, introduce you to the understanding of what are the key greenhouse gases that we're looking at, talk about the concept of carbon intensity, because this is really where the activity is in terms of the different types of carbon compounds, look at what the nature of carbon emissions are, and then talk about the production gap, because this is really where there's a certain amount of tension over just at what stage are we at and where will we need to be in terms of oil and gas production in order to achieve the kind of mitigating effects on climate change that are recognized by climate science as being needed. All right, well, now the main sort of banner is around what's called net zero emission. And this is where we're basically the emissions of greenhouse gases are balanced out by carbon removal. Okay, so this means basically we're going to have to find a way of removing from our production process the amount of emissions that result from operations. Okay, there's a closely related concept called carbon neutrality. Again, which carbon neutrality is a balancing out, but it's achieved as much by using trading and carbon offsets as by the actual removal of the carbon emissions. So we might say that the contrast here is that carbon neutrality is being achieved without actually removing emissions from the atmosphere. And this becomes important when you see references in literature, when you start to see references in company strategies and in national policies. Are they pursuing net zero, or are they trying to achieve carbon neutrality? Okay. Now, also a somewhat related term is the low carbon economy. Well, this is, again, it's a reference to the fact that we want to minimize the emission of carbon. Doesn't necessarily say that, we're going to sort of achieve a certain target by a certain schedule, but that we recognize that there needs to be this process of making a transition to low carbon economy. So the focus in this discussion is really going to be around net zero emissions. We'll from time to time talk about carbon neutrality and low carbon economy, but I want you to understand that the focus is on net zero emissions. Now, emissions of what? Well, so-called greenhouse gases. Now this is a term that has been around really since probably the mid-90s, but I think it helps to understand that, we're really talking about now carbon dioxide and methane, so CO2 and CH4s. Big concern with methane right now, primarily because, number one, it stays in the atmosphere longer than CO2, and also because it's around longer, it has a much amplified effect in terms of global warming. Some literature is saying it's almost 80 times more contributory to global warming than just the emissions of carbon dioxide on its own. If I put this up just because I started to remember a little my first year university organic chemistry, and thought, well, it doesn't hurt to show these as the molecules, and what is the bond. So we've got in both cases a single carbon molecule bonded either with oxygen in the case of CO2, or a molecular structure with 4 hydrocarbon atoms around the carbon. So, I put this up because later we're going to be talking about some of the technology, the solutions to carbon, and part of that technology is going to involve changing these molecular bonds. So now, when we start to measure carbon emissions, this is expressed in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents. And we're looking at what's the potential for global warming, and this is where we have to draw this comparison between CH4 and CO2. Now, the international standards for measuring carbon dioxide equivalent is there are several, of which the one that really does now seem to be sort of standing out as the standard for measuring is this greenhouse gas protocol. There have been others. ISO has one. US EPA has had one for a number of years. But so in terms of setting a baseline or doing an inventory or a stock take, the main frame of reference and standard is the World Resource Institute's greenhouse gas protocol. So when we look overall at the level of emissions, we're talking about, say, 50 billion tons a year of carbon dioxide equivalent. 73%, again, almost 3/4 is coming from energy use. But this includes petroleum as well as as the generation of electricity and other forms of energy. When we start to break down this category of energy use, and we look at the upstream industry, it represents 4 to 8% of carbon dioxide equivalents, depending on whether you look at indirect and indirect sources. Okay, now this is going to be another consideration when we start to go through the so-called carbon footprint of an industry. Is, are we looking at direct and indirect, and then consequential emissions as well? So main thing to come away with at this point is to recognize, that we're, say, 4 to 8% of CO2 emissions are attributable to upstream oil and gas activities. This slide gives you a little bit of a understanding for what's happening in terms of different areas around the world, and where we're looking at different types of emissions. So again, we're not looking at sort of a one size fits every operation. And it varies from region to region. It'll vary from field to field, but primarily in terms of the oil and gas industry, what we're looking at in the upstream is really the emissions that are coming from flaring, venting, and then looking at emissions that are coming from the pipeline systems, also coming from improperly abandoned wells. So this gives rise to the what's very topical now, called the production gap. In other words, looking at where we are now in terms of the level of production, what has to happen with upstream production in order to meet the goals for net zero emissions? Okay, so the forecast is that there needs to be an annual decline of 4 to 6% from 2020 to 2030. So over the next decade, we need to see a decline in order to achieve net zero emissions. So this again translates into a 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030. Okay, are we on that path? Quite frankly, we're not. And this is by the way, this comes out of a scenario prepared by the International Energy Commission. Okay, so they, in their scenario, which is just a single modeling exercise of how to achieve net zero, their recommendation was this level of decrease. But we know we need to be decreasing, and that this is going to happen over several decades now, where we've got really sort of two milestones to look at, 2030 and 2050. These milestones, we'll talk later on where they're coming from, but they're basically coming out of the Paris Agreement. So again, on the production gap, there's a recent report that's come from the United Nations. They did a survey to look at what is going to be expected. And what's important here is that the actual indication was that rather than decreasing production, the forecast was that they would be increasing production by more than 110%, then would be consistent with this target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Okay, so where will the cuts start to come from? Well, current plans, 240% on coal, and 57% or more on oil and gas, 71% on gas alone. Okay, this is in contrast to the projected increase in gas output. So where we are right now, you can see there's an obvious mismatch between what the recommendation is for achieving net zero in terms of reduction and what the plans are from the industry and from the various governments that host the industry. So this gives you, again, coming out of the IEA's net zero report, a picture of what the level of decline would be in terms of energy expressed in terms of extra joules, so that when we reach the target set for eliminating net zero emissions by 2050, different segments of the energy market are going to be served by this kind of portfolio of energy sources, where gas and oil are substantially reduced. Now, this is going to have implications, as I'm going to show you later on, in terms of the kinds of strategies and in terms of the kinds of tools that are going to be used if we're going to reach net zero by this target date. Okay, well, what's pushing or driving this interest in reductions? Well, we're going to talk about these topics: climate science, public opinion, the parallel process that I've already talked about, where we've got public and private activities going on slightly different tracks, the international framework that we're working within for net zero emissions. What are some of the national policies that are now starting to be formulated? How's this impacting on investment and financing? And then also another feature driving this is the level of litigation that's going on around climate change. Okay, so, well, climate science. There was a period, say in the 80s and 90s, where climate science was considered to be theory rather than fact. Now, this was, like I said, a period of kind of climate denial, but by 2020, 2016, we started to understand that this was indeed an issue that had to be addressed. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change conducted a process of literature reviews. They looked at over 30,000 scientific papers and came up with the conclusion that in order, to prevent the increase of global warming by 1.5 degrees, that if we weren't able to stop it at that level, then at that point there would be a significant change in the Earth's climate. This was backed up by an analysis done by NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, using their satellite technology and so-called big data to actually see physically what's happening in the change in the Earth's climate. So by this point, we are able now to conduct modeling of what climate change looks like. I should say also that this year the 2 Nobel Prizes in physics went to people who were involved in doing this kind of modeling. And if you can see on the right-hand side, we have this what's called the hockey stick diagram, that as emissions have increased, then they've increased exponentially. and with that so has global warming. Okay, so the process of sort of collating the data on climate change is handled by the World Climate Change Research Project, hosted by the World Meteorological Organization. And so, we have this international body that we can turn to look at how climate science is portraying global warming. Now, parallel to science, well, I should say, coming from the science, I guess, is the change in public opinion, and this is one of the sort of real pushes that's behind looking at the reduction and management of carbon emissions. So, 2020, Yale University did a survey, and 72% of the people surveyed believe that yes, climate change is happening. Now, what's interesting though is the breakdown between, is it due to human activity, anthropomorphic is the word, or was it due to weather? And there was more people actually thought it was probably a weather phenomenon than it was due to human activity. But they did feel that CO2 should be regulated. Okay. Now, following on from that, there was a global survey that was done. And out of the global survey, 64% believed that there was a climate emergency. The Pew Research Institute also canvassed a number of different countries, and they found that 72% considered that climate change would harm them personally. Okay, now this is important because once people go from saying, look, it's the weather, to that I'm going to be affected personally, this is when policymakers, at whether they're public or private, start to then formulate strategies for responding. So we have now a parallel process at the level of sort of public activity, public policy. We have the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is largely voluntary amongst the various countries that are signatory to the conventions and the protocols. At a national level, legislation and regulation, we're at the stage right now where there's a mix between voluntary and compulsory changes coming from industry regulators. At the private level, management are looking at corporate strategies for net zero emissions, or possibly for carbon neutrality. Various stakeholders are getting involved, shareholders, lenders, and they're all having an impact as well on how private policies are being formulated and the plans and the tools for reducing carbon emissions. Okay, so internationally, I said we've got this 1994 United Nations Framework on Climate Change. Some success early on with the Montreal Protocol, which was looking at how do we limit ozone depleting chemicals, which methane was considered to be one of the ozone depleting chemicals. And we know that the ozone layer is starting to heal now. So we did get success in that respect. Then the Kyoto Protocol, and the focus here with the Kyoto Protocol was on dealing with greenhouse emissions, the recognition that we had both advanced and developing countries, and also the recognition of clean development mechanisms and the ability to trade carbon offsets. And that feeds through into the Paris Agreement in 2016. Now I'm going to have a lot more to say about the Paris Agreement primarily because it now is the sort of the rule book, really, on how we're internationally on how we're going to deal with global climate change. You should be aware that there are other initiatives outside of the UN approach. There's been a gas flaring partnership managed through the World Bank. In Canada, there's the Oil Sands Pathway to Net Zero, which is a producer led activity. And so is and then there's the Net Zero Producers Forum, which again is led by governments that are major producers. If you're concerned or interested in how to track these national policies, the Grantham Research Institute, and I've given you the reference down there, maintains a very good database for you to, if you see where your country is at in terms of any, regulatory initiatives, and also in terms of what's being said by these countries around their national determined contributions, which throws us now into the Paris Agreement. About 191 countries are party to the agreement. Of those, 150 have submitted their national action plans. Again, this is voluntary, but the process is well underway for countries to formulate their approaches to how they're going to limit carbon emissions to achieve the net zero targets 2030 and 2050. After the COP26, which was the Glasgow Climate Summit, 90% of all emissions are covered now by some form of net zero target. Now, this may be the fact that some countries have said, look, we're not going to be able, like India, we're not going to be able to achieve this until 2060. Some have said 2070. But the important point here is that countries are well underway to developing their long-term low emission development strategies. And from the strategies will flow policies. From the policies will flow regulations and contract obligations. So if we look at the timeline coming out of the Paris Agreement, you can see that the target for net zero is at 2050, and this is the focus that we're working to, broadly speaking, in terms of this energy transition. How do we know where we want to get to, we set some targets, then we have to start working backward from the targets in terms of how we manage the emissions to get to that point. Now, the couple of features that I want you to be aware of coming out of the Paris Agreement. Number one is the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. In other words, countries are given the flexibility to look at how they're going to set their emissions targets according to their own national circumstances. Now, for the upstream oil and gas industry, this is very important because the issue is, is the upstream sector going to bear some of the burden of meeting the target that the country has committed to? And I've looked at a number of these submissions, and I've been surprised to see that for major oil and gas producing countries, there is no mention of whether their upstream oil and gas industry is going to be affected by the commitment the country has made. So it's always a good starting point to look at the nationally determined contribution and decide or realize whether the country you operate in has included that sector in their commitment. And then once you have a nationally determined contribution, then there is an iterative process of monitoring, reporting, and verification. Okay, so this is where, remember I talked about the global greenhouse gas protocol on how to measure carbon equivalency. So, you know, we have a standard for measuring, and then there will be a process of monitoring, reporting, and verification. This is now we're talking about what's happening internationally, but this process will also impact on individual companies as well. Every 5 years, there's a national communication on looking at what's happened in terms of the vulnerability and impact from climate change. And then there's also this concept of progression, so that each time you do your NDC, that you're going to be part of that process is that it becomes more advanced, more stringent. And also the Paris Agreement recognized the principle of being able to transfer emission reductions. Now this was important because it was a key feature in the Kyoto Protocol, as I mentioned, with the clean development mechanisms. And so, but there had been a lot of disagreement since 2016, just over how a lot of these principles that were reflected in the Paris Agreement were going to be handled in terms of the detail. Well, that's something that's now been addressed at this Glasgow Climate Pact. But the point I want to just sum up the international process with is to show you that it's a three-stage activity: planning, implementation, and then reviewing. Okay, so this is the cycle that internationally we're working to in terms of managing the emission of carbon and other greenhouse gases. Okay, so a bit of a case study here in terms of nationally determined contribution to give you a feel about how it works. Australia submitted their NDC in December 2020, and they said, look, we're going to deal with this primarily by the deployment of technology. Now, this is, again, a feature right now of where we're at in terms of carbon management is a lot of proposals are focusing on technology, and we do have the advantage of several decades now for this technology to be scaled up and proven and available for investment. And so this is really, I think, where one of the main activities is for individual oil and gas producers is, how are you going to balance your carbon management strategy between technology and between divestitures, between being able to do some kind of offset trading. Okay, so Australia's 2030 target take the form of an emissions budget between 2021 and 2030, and the Australian Prime Minister, just in advance of COP26, said that the plan is to deliver net zero using technology, not taxes, by 2050. However, Australia did not commit itself to the Global Methane Pledge that came out of COP26, largely saying that they didn't want to put this burden on the agricultural livestock sector, not so much on the fossil methane. Now, according to the Climate Action Tracker, which is a website that evaluates the ability of these nationally determined plans to achieve net zero, the Australia proposal is considered to be highly insufficient, meaning you're not going to achieve your target with the tools that you're selecting. This is in contrast with the NDC submitted by the U.S., which Climate Tracker said is merely insufficient. But at this stage, I should add that the Climate Action Tracker considers everybody's plans to be insufficient. I say this because it's just an indication of the where we are, meaning we have a long way to go. Okay, the Glasgow Climate Pact. Just the Glasgow Summit just wrapped up slightly less than a month ago here in Scotland. As I said, 90% of emissions are now covered by a net zero target, with the target date sort of slipping to being more around 2060 than 2050. One of the main features now for the industry is the phase out of inefficient fuel subsidies for fossil fuels. Now this is going to have an impact on the oil and gas industry. And this is the one feature where so far this framework convention approach has actually mentioned the oil and gas industry by reference to fossil fuel subsidies. The other key feature of Glasgow was the resolution of the so-called Paris Rulebook. In other words, we needed to have an understanding on how to tabulate emissions, and also we needed to have an understanding on what was going to happen with carbon trading for the development of a global carbon market. So that we now have the accounting rules, or something like 54 pages, to improve the transparency, reliability, and liquidity of the voluntary carbon markets. As you can appreciate, a big part of carbon management is really, and it's an accounting function. We have to have a base inventory, and then we have to be able to measure emissions, both in terms of removal and in terms of any trading of carbon offsets. Now, a little bit more about the Paris Rulebook, otherwise known as the H20 Climate Package, finally completed after 6 years of discussion. One of the big issues is how to eliminate double counting and the transfer of emission credits under the Kyoto Protocol. So that's there's a cap that's been set on Kyoto Protocol offsets, and we now have this transparency process for trading. Now, one of the other features we highlighted was the subsidies and getting rid of subsidies. Okay, well, now the World Trade Organization says a subsidy is a financial contribution by a government or public body to give a selective advantage. It can come in many forms: R&D funding, grants, loan guarantees, tax breaks, and even the release of petroleum from emergency reserves, much like we saw in the US a couple of weeks ago. Now, the beneficiaries are either consumers or producers. Now, this is important because many countries have had a policy of keeping energy cheap for consumers. And on the other hand, there have been a number of policies, particularly around fiscal regimes, which have resulted in direct subsidies to oil and gas producers. But the International Energy Agency says that there's something like around $180 billion annually that the oil and gas industry benefits from. Now, the beneficiaries can be, again, consumers or producers. Their approach to a subsidy is to say, you know, you take a reference price, subtract the end user price, times the number of units consumed. Okay, so in other words, if the price of oil and gas is artificially low, then there is a subsidy. And one of the issues about how to establish a reference price is, what about the externalities in terms of something like global climate change? So, you know, if we're not seeing the cost of global climate change reflected in the price to the end user, then it follows from this methodology that there is a subsidy. The International Monetary Fund, they say that there's something like 5.9 trillion in direct and indirect subsidies. Okay, so they're taking in the subsidies to consumers as well as producers. So this issue has been debated now since 2009, and the first commitment that was made was the G20 and APEC leaders said they would rationalize and phase out over time inefficient fuel subsidies that encourage wasteful consumption. Okay, so we're now seeing this concern or this initiative reflected in climate policy coming out of the Glasgow Climate Pact. So it's a turning point now for looking at what's being said about subsidies. And this is in Article 5, Article 5, Article 36 calls upon the parties to accelerate efforts to phase out inefficient subsidies. Now, I highlight this because if you remember the tension over coal, and the language was changed to phase down from phase out, but in terms of subsidies, it's a clear commitment now that they'll be phased out. Well, let's take again a closer look at what we're talking about in terms of phasing out subsidies. And so here in the UK, there's various measures that reduce the burden on the upstream sector. There was a 2015 simplification of the tax regime, and then the introduction of transferable tax history to remove tax barriers to new investment in the North Sea. And so these are the kinds of activities now that are going to have to be reviewed and phased out. The other feature coming out of COP26 is the concept of a just transition. Now, this is contained in Article 7, Para 52, and this is basically saying that this transition is going to hit different groups with greater or lesser impact. And so part of the this just transition is as we move to a low carbon economy, how do we minimize the disruption to communities, consumers, and other stakeholders? Good example of this, 2021 UK North Sea transition deal. Again, voluntary reduction, 50% of emissions, and a transition plan for the workforce. So that's a very good example of an effort at a just transition. Similarly, American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 provided grants to state and local governments to deal with local energy and climate measures. So, activities already there. Side deals coming out of COP26. Okay, now remember, the Paris Agreement approach is you've got to get everybody on board. So but nevertheless, there will be initiatives where not all countries would come on board. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a substantial commitment. One is this Global Methane Pledge. So 130 countries out of something like 197 agreed to the reduction of methane emissions by 30% by 2030. Over 2020 levels, this is about 70 million tons a year that's going to be reduced. And one of the key considerations is, are you operating in a country that has committed to the Global Methane Pledge? Because this puts you immediately, in the sort of target zone, if you will, for making these reductions. Now, several large producers did not sign the Global Methane Pledge: Australia, China, India, Russia, Turkey, South Africa. But on the other hand, significantly, Canada did sign the Global Methane Pledge, which is interesting because previously Canada had taken the approach with methane that it would not be part of their nationally determined contribution. So this is a big about face in methane reduction, particularly if you're operating in Canada. The other development was the H20 Initiative. Now this is basically a multi-company commitment. So 28 major companies from a broad variety of sectors made the commitment that they would enter into operational changes of their carbon emissions in order to maintain the 1.5 degree Celsius scenario. Other than that, there was the Beyond the Oil and Gas Alliance. This is something relatively new. These are, again, commitments by countries to stop oil and gas exploration. Okay, so primarily France, Greenland, Ireland, Sweden, Wales, the Quebec province in Canada, and this was led by Denmark and Costa Rica. There's two tiers of membership for the BYOGA, and that other governments like New Zealand, the state of California, are lower tier members. But this basically is to sort of align themselves with the IEA report that we talked about earlier, where they said there should be no further oil and gas exploration from the date of the report if we're going to achieve this 1.5 degree target. Now, okay, we have to bring this down to national policies. And so there are going to be, first of all, various approaches to carbon emissions, whether they're going to be voluntary or compulsory. Is the sector in the national determined contribution? Is carbon looked at as a pollutant or as a potential resource? Is the goal carbon neutrality or is the goal net zero? And how does this impact on the maximum efficient rate of recovery for existing oil fields and for new discoveries? And then finally, how, if we administer these national policies, what form are they going to take? Permits, mandatory control technology, changes in licenses, extensions, approval of development and work programs. Well, here's a quick sort of summary of things that are happening already. Okay, in the U.S., there have been several executive orders as well as new regulations published on mainly looking at methane to start with. But notice one of the executive orders on oil and gas leasing on federal lands and federal waters is a concept called a fitness to operate. So this is something to pay attention to in terms of how would you meet this standard if in fact it is going to be adopted. I mentioned in the UK the transition deal for progressive decarbonization, looking at a voluntary commitment of reducing CO2 emissions by 2030. The European Union has adopted draft regulations banning flaring and venting and penalties for leaking fossil fuel, applies to infrastructure. But what's key here is that these regulations, if they are adopted, will apply to imported fuels as well. Okay, so by extension, if you're selling into the European Union, you will then be bound to have to comply with the regulations on reducing flaring and venting. Maximum efficient rate of recovery. I found this, it's a bit of a sidelight, but it's very interesting because it's been gospel in the oil and gas industry that you want to manage reservoirs for achieving maximum efficient recovery. In the case of the UK, it's actually part of the Oil and Gas Act. But the comment now is that if MER is an obstacle to reaching these targeted reductions, that principle will have to be abrogated in order to meet the national targets. There are gaps in regulation, a number of ones. We don't have to cover all of them here, but what we will be looking at is how are these nationally determined contributions being translated into guidance, into regulations, into licenses and agreements. Now, part of the implementation strategy is also what's happening, on a industry level, driven by stakeholders, driven by strategies for portfolio management, driven by best practices coming out of trade associations, driven by sort of this concept of the circular carbon economy, where you reduce, reuse, recycle, or remove CO2. Well, let's just quickly talk about how international majors are responding to it and how some national oil companies are responding to it. So a number of companies have embraced net zero by 2050. Shell, Equinor, Repsol, Occidental. These companies are also committing to use nature-based solutions, in other words, carbon trading. And Shell has made a certain amount of publicity with their net zero or carbon neutral LNG cargoes that they're providing, basically looking at the use of carbon offsets. Now, slightly different approach with North American majors. They're looking at reducing emission intensity by look with a reference to scope 1, scope 2 emissions. And Exxon recently said they'll reduce to net zero in the Permian Basin by 2030. Number of majors have committed to an industry initiative on reducing methane emissions. I noticed Gazprom is one of them, even though Russia didn't sign the Global Methane Pledge. I find that kind of a curious mismatch. National oil companies are sort of we have to look at those individually. Typically, they are making less of a contribution to global carbon emissions than their international peers. But nevertheless, there are commitments that have been made. I think it's interesting to just take a quick look at this table. Notice that for example, Saudi Aramco is they are looking at reducing their emissions for scope 1 direct, scope 2 indirect by 2060, even though they're planning on ramping up production. Petronas says they have an aspiration to reduce flaring and venting by 2015. Pertamina, they've committed to a transition to green energy. This by the way, this includes investing in renewables. So you're going to get these sort of former petroleum companies that transition to become energy companies. Oman, the commitment is to carbon neutrality, not to net zero. Same with Petrobras, commitment to carbon neutrality. There are also are a number of financial alliances that are involved, and they're again one of the main driving features of energy transition is the ability to draw on financing. And the oil and gas industry is one of the most capital intensive industries in the world. So this is a key consideration is, how will you arrange project financing if you have to go into the commercial capital markets. Institutional investors, okay, these are pension funds and national development funds. And so there's again a movement here to say, look, again, no funding from national wealth funds unless you have made a commitment and have a transition plan. I mentioned litigation as a driver. Here, there's something like close to 1,900, 2,000 reported claims that involve challenges based on global climate warming. The most significant one, of course, is this decision by the trial court in The Hague, which ordered Royal Dutch Shell to cut its carbon emissions by 45% by the end of 2030 compared to 2019 levels. Also in the developing world, Guyana's Constitutional Court has agreed to hear a petition by local environmentalists to halt Exxon's offshore production. Here in the UK, there's an application in front of the High Court for judicial review of oil and gas subsidies. So there's a fair amount of activity going on here, which is sort of outside of the the meeting rooms for the international organizations, outside of the boardrooms for the companies, and in the courtroom. So a lot of impetus for dealing with climate change is coming from this area as well. Well, we are quite at the full time. I've still got just a few slides I want to cover on what's the response going to look like in terms of strategies for decarbonization. Well, the main game right now is emission counting, and we have this procedure. You've seen it in the slides for scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Okay, scope 1 are the direct emissions coming from the production process itself. Scope 2 are the indirect emissions, say, from people that are supplying the steel for the jackets and the platforms and the pipelines. And then scope 3 is the actual use of oil and gas, in the consuming sector. So when we look at the upstream industry, this is basically, what we're talking about in terms of the CO2 concentrations, the intensity of CO2. You can see that a big part of this is the production flaring, although, you've also got issues around things like how are you providing fuel for the various pumps and other drivers that are being used. in the field. Scope 2, well, this is basically you're looking at an inventory of emissions that take into consideration now the supplies that have to be delivered, whether they're the manufacture of the drilling mud, the drill stem, these types of things, that are used in actually completing and producing a well. And now scope 3 is this, how are we going to account for indirect transmissions? And finally, talking about scope 3. Now, this is where, if you noticed, there's a certain reluctance in the industry to actually embrace scope 3 emissions when it comes to upstream activities. Okay, and I think this is completely understandable, because it's one thing to say, okay, we can account for scope 1 direct, we can account for scope 2 indirect, but when it comes to scope 3, you're talking about sort of broader societal use, and also the possibility of double counting. If you're generating electricity using natural gas, that's going to be treated as a scope 1 emission by the operator of the gas plant. If you so does it follow that should be counted in the emission inventory of the gas supplier? So that there's a certain effort that has to go into working out just how broadly you want to do this carbon footprint kind of inventory. The IPICEA, which is an international environmental trade body for the oil industry and American Petroleum Industry, American Petroleum Institute, have been working on methodologies for how you would do this kind of accounting. Now we have the Paris Rulebook, which helps with the tabulation and add more certainty and transparency. Big part of this process of accounting is certification. Okay, so you're going to need to be able to get an independent certification that your emissions are of a certain quantity and that your achievement of their reduction is at a certain quantity. So part of there are various certification bodies that have to come into the picture. In terms of carbon reduction, the big issue is really, are they going to be technology based, or will you use some other approach? What I want to do here with the rest of the time is basically focus on the emphasis on new technology. Okay, you saw us from previous slides. There's a heavy emphasis, both public and private, on technology. The mantra from Australia, technology, not taxes. Okay, so this really means we have to look at what's happening with the key technologies, which is carbon capture and storage, and the manufacture of hydrogen. Right now, at this point, where those processes are really at a demonstration level, they haven't been scaled up. There's various plans for increased investment, and also there have been several notable commercial failures, like the Petronova CCS project in the Gulf in the United States. So a big question here: how far can you go and rely on new technology? So hydrogen, I mentioned, that we wanted to look at what happens molecularly when we use electrolysis to convert carbon compounds to to hydrogen energy. And so the main feature here is going to be, where is the energy going to come from to do this? Because it's one thing to say, yes, you want to reduce emissions, but if you require substantial inputs of energy from other sources, are you in, you may be reducing emissions at one point, but increasing emissions at another point. And then also issues around, the cost and where's the financing coming from. I mentioned the offset as another tool that's in addition to technology. So we now know that, yes, it's acceptable for purposes of meeting national targets to use offsets. And this is going to be one of the areas that's going to get more attention and advance quickly now that that issue has been resolved. Divestitures and acquisitions. Again, this is part of the sort of circular energy transition where you move from purely oil and gas production to investment in renewables. This is a strategy taken by a number of private companies, BP particularly, Shell. Also, the Ugandan National Oil Company is investing in the Ugandan electrical company. So this is an example of that. What very quickly, what are some of the strategies? Well, in a company like Exxon is involved in a large-scale divestiture process for Africa and Europe, expanding production in the U.S. Shell, they have an energy transition plan for some divestment in the upstream, as well as commitments to investment in hydrogen, in renewables and carbon capture. So this is, diversification is another strategy, certainly, for meeting your reduction in carbon emissions. Right. Bottom line, in terms of new discoveries, is whether or not they're likely to become a stranded asset. Okay, good example last week. The announcement of Shell that it's withdrawing from the development of the Campbell oil field, and they've said that the economic investment case is not strong enough at this time. Okay, so part of that analysis would have included a climate assessment in terms of the impact. Yes, we need to build our knowledge base in the areas of engineering and construction, regulation, compliance, and legal and finance. So part of the reason we're having the webinar, quite frankly, is to highlight the areas that are complex, where we need to fill in these knowledge gaps. Ultimately, we'll be working to this kind of circular plan implementation review internally as well as internationally. Right. Oh, just one thing here. Transition is lengthy and complex. And remember, the word is net in net zero. So it doesn't mean we stop oil and gas production. It just means we have to do it in a way that we control carbon emissions. Should say we have an upcoming seminar on the 2nd and 3rd of March, 2-day seminar where we are going to look at some of these topics that are more complex in greater detail, looking at how the global protocol applies to these inventories, what are the methods and scope for dealing with scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, by the way, this concept of these three scope classes comes out of the global protocol. What's coming up for the work program under the Paris Agreement? There's a meeting in Egypt in 2022 at Sharm el Sheikh. There's a list of activities that countries will be working on internationally that will start to implement some of these changes that were agreed to in the Glasgow Pact. And there are these additional initiatives, the Global Methane Pledge. We're going to look at day 2, focusing on more on the internal planning, decarbonization strategies, and preparing transition plans. Look, I appreciate your sticking with me. I know we've gone over time a little bit. I'd be happy at this stage, if you like, to take questions or comments. As Anastasis mentioned, if we run out of time or you run out of time, you're welcome to email your question. We'll be happy to get back to you. Thank you once again for your time and your attention.
Thanks, Dennis. During the talk, we only had one question come through in the messages. I don't know if any more will come through now. It was from egeorge@gmail. I'm not sure of the first name, but it was asking, where are we? Shell strategy. Well, that's Geese reply. Where is it? The question was to one of your slides, how can that be true when Shell has started the process of doing seismic studies in South African eastern coast? What is their real strategy? So I guess maybe there's a bit of cynicism in the corporate speak and what people see in reality. So I'm not sure if you've got any answer to that, Dennis.
Yeah, well, obviously there are exploration programs that have been ongoing, have been funded, and they may be at a stage that you simply can't withdraw from them. So that would explain, why you see still work programs going ahead, exploration programs going ahead, is that you have to honor previous existing commitments. Obviously, in this Cambo situation that we talked about, they were at a decision point where they had the flexibility to either commit or not commit. So I think part of the explanation is going to be, at what stage are you at? What kind of commitments have you made in pre-existing agreements?
Yep. Yeah, there are no more questions coming through. If anyone's got them, send them through now, because we have run over time and we don't want to hold everybody up if there are no questions coming. But as Dennis said, we've got the seminar coming up and it's live on Eventbrite, so you can check it out there. And we are doing a repeat of this webinar in February for the North American time zone, which will be late in the MENA time zone, late in the afternoon. So you can always join again or let your colleagues know about this event again. Okay, we're getting some thanks through from the participants. I guess you can see the chat. I'm not sure if you can or not, Dennis. But,
not on my screen.
Yeah, we'll be sending an email through with the follow-up details and the YouTube links for the recording. And somebody asked about the slides. We're not handing them out in this webinar, but we will provide them in the seminars, I believe. Is that right, Dennis?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say, if you want to send questions through in advance of the March seminar, that would be great. We'd be happy to be prepared to be sure we answer questions that would come up in the seminar.
Yeah, and the seminar is public. I don't know if there's anybody out there that thinks this could be useful for their, internal, internally at their company. We're always open to discuss that with you. So just drop us an email at training@esandaengineering.com, and we can discuss that further as well. Okay, because our core is training. So if you've got any training requirements, I should be plugging that as well and letting you know to get in touch about that. Yeah, okay. That's it from me. If there are no more questions, I'd like to thank Dennis and Ezra for helping out, letting you all into the event. And hopefully we've got 12 webinars coming up next year, not including the second version of this. So keep an eye out on Eventbrite for what's coming up. Okay. And some public courses as well. We'll be promoting them on Eventbrite as well. All right. So,
thank you, and see you later.
Thank you. All right. Okay. Well, we'll close the session down now if that's it. I'll hang back for a minute just in case anyone sends a question through. But thank you.